What if I told you that the deadliest massacre in ancient Rome didn't happen on a battlefield, but inside an arena built for fun? At the height of the empire's glory, under a sky that glowed blood red in October of AD 52, nearly 19,000 condemned men lowered their weapons, believing they had won mercy. These were exhausted fighters, criminals, prisoners of war, desperate souls who had just spent hours slashing, stabbing, and ramming ships in a colossal artificial lake. They had saluted their emperor with the famous words, "Morituri te salutant." Those who are about to die salute you. They had given Rome the spectacle it craved, the floating chaos of naval combat, staged not for survival, but for entertainment. Now knee-deep in water-stained crimson, they waited for the purple-draped Emperor Claudius to deliver his promise. Mercy, freedom, life. Instead, the imperial horns blared. Not the notes of pardon, but the shrill call to resume combat. The promise had been theater. The mercy had been a lie. Panic rippled through 19,000 throats. Some threw down their swords. Others shouted, pleading that they had fought as ordered. But along the arena's edge, Praetorian archers raised their bows. Arrows sliced the air not to kill quickly, but to wound, forcing the condemned to pick up their weapons and bleed for Rome again. There was no shore to swim toward, no exit that wasn't barred by spears. The water that moments earlier had felt like survival now became a trap. Every ripple was another death sentence, and the crowd cheered. Senators, priests, mothers with children all leaning forward, intoxicated by betrayal, disguised as justice. This was not war. It was not ritual. It was industrialized murder for the sake of applause. Rome had perfected what no other civilization had dared, turning human lives into expendable content, long before that word existed. And yet what made it most terrifying was not the cruelty of Claudius alone, but the silence of the spectators who accepted it. For hours they sat beneath the autumn sun, watching their fellow human beings drown, stab, and claw at each other, all because their emperor had decided that obedience did not deserve reward. But here is the shocking truth: Rome did not start this way. It began centuries earlier with something smaller, quieter, almost innocent. A funeral. 6 slaves ordered to fight in honor of a dead nobleman. What began as a duty to the dead became an addiction for the living. From that moment, blood was never enough. More funerals, more fights, more corpses, and within just 3 generations, grief had mutated into spectacle and spectacle into politics. So how did the world's most advanced empire convince itself that slaughter was sacred, that betrayal could be beautiful, and that the drowning of 19,000 men was not tragedy, but triumph? How did they build arenas capable of swallowing thousands of souls? And how did ordinary Romans, men, women, children, justify screaming for more? This is the dark history of ancient Rome's bloody entertainments. This is the shocking truth of a forgotten empire. And by the end of this story, you might realize that the Colosseum never really disappeared. It simply changed shape. It did not begin with an emperor. It did not begin with marble stadiums, roaring crowds, or carefully engineered lakes designed for slaughter. It began with a funeral. A single man's death planted the seed of a civilization's addiction to blood. The year was 264 BC, and Decimus Junius Brutus Sceva had just lost his father. His family was noble, his name respected, and Roman tradition demanded a display of honor. But tradition had never seen what Decimus was about to unveil. The body of his father lay wrapped in fine cloth, resting on a pyre, incense curling into the air. Relatives wept softly, their grief punctuated by the solemn notes of funeral hymns. To the mourners, it should have been a day of reverence, of memory. But Decimus wanted more. He wanted to transform grief into spectacle. So he announced a munus, a duty to the dead. 6 slaves were dragged into the cleared space before the pyre. They were not gladiators. They were not soldiers. They were farmhands, men whose hands had spent years gripping plows and pulling harvests, not swords. Their faces were pale, their bodies trembling, and in their eyes flickered the first recognition of what Rome was about to become. "Fight," Decimus commanded. "Honor my father with your blood." The words chilled the crowd. Human sacrifice they thought belonged to barbarians, not Rome. But Decimus insisted this was different. This was not meaningless killing. This was ritual. This was sacred duty. This was Rome. The first pair of slaves circled one another, their breath loud against the silence of the crowd. One of them, let us call him Marcus, glanced back at the funeral pyre, then at the armed guards hemming him in. He understood the arithmetic: fight your friend or die anyway. This was no choice at all. With a desperate shout, Marcus swung his unfamiliar bronze sword. His friend stumbled. The blade cut flesh. Blood sprayed across the ground, soaking into the sacred earth meant for mourning. The crowd gasped, not in horror, but in fascination. Something new had entered Roman life, the spectacle of controlled death. When the first man collapsed, the second pair was pushed forward, then the third. By the time the last sword fell silent, 3 men lay dead, and 3 stood covered in blood and disbelief. Decimus, satisfied, declared that the survivors were free. Honor, justice, mercy, balanced perfectly. The crowd murmured their approval. "Beautiful," someone whispered. "The Etruscans do this, but here, it has Roman dignity." That moment cracked something open in the Roman soul. The guests had arrived to mourn, but they left exhilarated, whispering not of the deceased nobleman, but of the fights. They asked questions: who had shown courage, who had skill even without training, who might face whom at the next funeral. What began as grief had mutated into curiosity. Rome had tasted blood and found it intoxicating. Within months, other noble families copied the display. At first, 1 pair of slaves was enough, then 2, then 3. Each funeral demanded escalation. And though the excuse remained the same, "This is our munus, our duty to the dead." Everyone knew the truth. They were not there for piety. They were there for spectacle. One elderly senator, disturbed yet unable to look away, wrote to his son, "Yesterday I attended Quintus's funeral. The contests unsettled me, yet I find my mind returning to them constantly. There was something pure in those struggles, something true." His letter spread quietly among the Roman elite as if shame itself was addictive. These men, guardians of tradition, began to see in the desperate clashes of slaves not sacrilege, but entertainment. The line between ritual and recreation blurred, and once blurred, it could never be restored. By 216 BC, less than 50 years later, the transformation was undeniable. Funerals no longer centered on the dead. They centered on the living and on how many lives could be spent in their honor. Private grief had mutated into public addiction. The word munus no longer meant duty, it meant blood. The Senate itself, that bastion of Roman dignity, began to bend under the pressure of this new hunger. Candidates debated not policies, but numbers. How many pairs of fighters could you promise? 10, 15, 20 votes could be purchased with bodies. Rome's political system began to drink from the same cup as its mourning rituals. The more deaths you offered, the stronger your position became. And yet behind all of this lay the original lie, the same lie Claudius would one day repeat to 19,000 men. That ritual violence has meaning. That orchestrated death serves justice. that watching men kill each other somehow honors the living or the dead. It was a fiction, but it was a fiction Rome embraced. And every time another slave fell bleeding onto the soil, the crowd's doubts faded further. Here lies the shocking truth of ancient Rome's dark history. What began as grief became governance. The cries of 6 trembling farmhands in 264 BC echoed for centuries, shaping the politics, culture, and conscience of the greatest empire on earth. And in their echo, we can hear something else, an unease that belongs not just to them, but to us. Because the question we must ask is not why they watched. It is why we still do. Why do we, in our world of screens and streams, still feel the same fascination when tragedy is packaged as spectacle? Why do we scroll, click, and cheer at humiliation, pain, and downfall just as Romans once cheered Marcus and his doomed companions? Maybe the forgotten empire isn't so forgotten. Maybe its bloody games live on, only translated into digital form. By the 3rd century before Christ, Rome had discovered that death could be currency. What began as 6 trembling farmhands at a funeral now became a bargaining chip in the highest halls of power. Ambitious men realized that spilling blood bought loyalty more effectively than any speech. Candidates for office promised not roads, not laws, but corpses. Elections became auctions of death. By 216 BC, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus stood before the Senate, sweat soaking his toga. He was not pleading for war funds or trade agreements. He was haggling over numbers of slaves to die. 20 pairs, he demanded. My opponent offers 15. The people expect more. The senators nodded gravely, not at the blasphemy of turning men into votes, but at the arithmetic. This was Rome now. The louder the crowd screamed, the higher your career climbed. Blood was no longer ritual, it was political capital. But politics is never satisfied with mere imitation. One man decided to raise the stakes. His name was Gaius Scribonius Curio, and he was desperate for power. He had no great victories to boast, no legendary fortune to display. What he had was imagination and a willingness to bankrupt himself for attention. His idea, 2 massive wooden theaters back to back. By day, citizens could watch plays, but when evening came, the structures would rotate on giant pivots, snapping together into one colossal oval. An amphitheater, a blood machine. Curio had invented the first true gladiatorial stage, not bound to funerals, but to entertainment itself. When he announced his plan, traditionalists cried sacrilege. Without religious purpose, this is madness, they shouted. But others, hungrier for approval, countered, the people love these contests. Why deny them considerate welfare? The Senate voted yes. Democracy had just voted for mass murder. A republic founded on civic virtue had redefined virtue as spectacle. Once the door was opened, there was no closing it. Every ambitious Roman now understood speeches could be forgotten, but a grand spectacle carved itself into memory. Julius Caesar, young and burning with ambition, borrowed ruinous sums to fund 320 pairs of gladiators. His rivals mocked his bankruptcy. The people, dazzled, whispered of silver armor gleaming in the sun. Silver on men who would not live an hour. Caesar's gamble worked. He purchased not only votes, but a myth. Rome's most brilliant minds had discovered that the fastest way to power was through orchestrated slaughter. And soon architecture itself bent to this purpose. Amphitheaters rose like temples of cruelty, their wooden beams echoing with screams. Caesar himself went further, dreaming beyond the stage. Why settle for swords on sand when you could recreate entire wars? He ordered prisoners to dig a massive basin in Rome, a pit larger than any forum, deeper than a 3-story building. To the laborers, he claimed it was a reservoir. They laughed, relieved that their punishment had at least some utility. But when the aqueducts flooded the pit, they realized too late they had been building their own tomb. Into this artificial lake, Caesar launched ships built to replicate the Battle of Salamis. Greeks versus Persians history replayed as theater. Except the actors were not volunteers. They were condemned men chained to oars, forced to ram and stab and drown each other in front of tens of thousands. History itself became a death sentence. The audience cheered as wood splintered and bodies sank. By nightfall, 3 ships floated among thousands of corpses. Caesar, magnanimous, spared the survivors. The crowd roared. Mercy, they cried. But mercy was simply another performance. What Caesar began, Augustus perfected. Where Caesar improvised with basins, Augustus engineered permanence. He ordered the construction of the Aqua Alsiatina, an entire aqueduct designed not to bring water for crops or homes, but to flood arenas for naval battles. Think of the scale: miles of channels, thousands of laborers, entire groves, cut down cemeteries, uprooted all so that Romans could watch men drown more efficiently. Rome had built plumbing for death. Vitruvius, the empire's great engineer, documented it meticulously. His surviving plans read like sacred scripture of cruelty, water depth, calibrated at 12 feet deep enough to drown, but shallow enough for easy cleanup. Ballast sealed to prevent desperate prisoners from weighing themselves down to die quickly. Drainage systems designed to carry corpses away between shows. Rome's genius had been weaponized. Mathematics became murder. Architecture became execution. Engineering became atrocity, and in the shadows of these marvels a new profession emerged, the bestiarii, the beastmasters. Their job was not to fight, but to craft cruelty with precision. They calculated how many days of starvation made lions reliably vicious: 7. Bears required only 4. Leopards were unpredictable, so they experimented with scents. One surviving diary notes tested lamb's blood mixed with honey. Bear responded immediately and thoroughly, recommended for future use. Science itself bent to the appetite of the mob. For the condemned, there was no escape. Some tried starving themselves, hoping to be unappetizing. Others trained their bodies, praying strength might buy survival. But innovation always favored Rome. Guards sprayed prisoners with animal blood to make them smell like prey. When captives smeared themselves with their own filth to mask the scent, beast masters countered with oils that cut through stench. Even suicide was denied. A man who hung himself robbed the crowd of entertainment. Guards began watching prisoners around the clock, binding their hands, except at meals. Rome worked harder to keep its victims alive for slaughter than it did to feed its citizens. And what of the men forced to operate this machinery? One guard wrote to his wife, "Today, I cut down a man trying to hang himself. Tomorrow, I will watch him fed to the bears. I no longer sleep." Another engineer recorded the drowning of 20 slaves during a test flood trapped behind sealed bronze doors. His supervisor denied rescue. Better 20 slaves than Caesar's disgrace. The test was deemed a success. Human life had become a metric of efficiency. This was the true rising tension of Rome's dark history. By the time of Augustus, the empire's finest architects, philosophers, and politicians were no longer debating virtue or law. They were debating logistics of slaughter, how to house gladiators, how to train beasts, how to maximize suffering while minimizing cost. Rome had become a machine grinding human beings into applause. And here is the most disturbing truth: the crowd accepted it. Ordinary men, women, and children packed the stands. They leaned forward as arrows flew, laughed as ships sank, cheered as animals tore flesh. They were no longer citizens. They were consumers. The line between grief and politics, between ritual and science, between man and monster, had dissolved. This is the shocking truth of ancient Rome's bloody games. Once cruelty becomes entertainment, there is no limit. Rome was not content with slaughter alone. It wanted meaning itself to burn. By the 1st century, the empire's appetite for blood had grown so ravenous that even myth and faith were no longer safe. Stories that once taught courage and morality became scripts for execution. Gods, heroes, and saints were dragged into the arena not to inspire, but to be desecrated. Rome had learned the darkest trick of all, to turn belief into spectacle. At the grand opening of the Colosseum in AD 80, Emperor Titus promised a show beyond imagination. Among the condemned was a Greek prisoner named Alexios, chosen for his skill with the lyre. He was dressed as Orpheus, the legendary musician, whose songs could tame wild beasts. A flowing white robe, a laurel crown, a golden lyre glinting under the Mediterranean sun. For a moment from the emperor's box, it looked as though myth itself had stepped into reality. The crowd hushed. Children tugged at their fathers' togas, whispering the story Orpheus will play and the animals will lie at his feet. Alexios strummed the strings, his fingers coaxing out melodies of love and hope. For a heartbeat, the myth seemed alive. Then the gate clanged open. A half-starved bear lumbered into the arena ribs, showing hunger engineered by handlers who had measured precisely how many days without food would guarantee violence. Alexios played louder, his music trembling with desperation. The bear paused, cocked its head, confused for an instant, and then it charged. The song ended in a scream, the lyre shattering against the sand myth murdered before 50,000 eyes. This was Rome's genius and its horror. It did not merely kill men, it killed meaning. A story that had survived centuries was rewritten in a single afternoon. Every child in that arena left with a new ending burned into memory. Orpheus does not charm beasts, he is torn apart by them. If even gods and heroes could be broken, what hope was left for ordinary men? But Nero went further. For him, execution was not enough. It had to be art. His favorite invention was the tunica molesta, the troublesome shirt. Prisoners were stripped, smeared with wax, and dressed in a coarse garment soaked in pitch and sulfur. At sunset, the condemned were mounted on poles in Nero's gardens. With a torch's touch, they ignited into human candles, illuminating feasts, where Rome's elite strolled between burning bodies, sipping wine and discussing poetry. Justice had become stage lighting. Mercy had become mockery. One of these victims was Claudia, a Christian seamstress accused of insulting Roman gods. As guards painted her with pitch, she looked them in the eye and said, "You dress me in flame, but clothe yourselves in shame. My pain ends tonight. Your guilt burns forever." Her executioner, a young guard named Gaius, faltered. He resumed his duty, but his hands shook. That night, he deserted the army. In his barracks, he left a note, "I have painted my last innocent with pitch. Let Rome find other hands for its horrors." Yet Nero's cruelty backfired. Among the spectators was the Christian philosopher Tertullian, who saw not the end of faith, but its beginning. He wrote, "The blood of martyrs is the seed of the church. Every body that burned lit not Rome's gardens, but the fire of resistance." What Nero imagined as annihilation became evangelism. The victims sang as they died, confusing and unnerving the crowd. They broke the script. They did not beg, curse, or collapse in despair. They prayed. They forgave. They smiled. One young woman, Perpetua, entered the arena carrying her infant daughter. She handed the child to a fellow believer and stretched her arms toward the leopards. Her diary survives. "Tomorrow, I fight beasts in the arena. but I have already won. They can kill this body, but my true life begins at death." The crowd expected hysteria. They saw transcendence, and many left disturbed. Another martyr, Blandina, a slave from Gaul, endured torments so grotesque that hardened soldiers vomited. Burned with irons, mauled by beasts tied to a stake, she never wavered. "I am a Christian. We do nothing wrong," she repeated. Her executioner, a veteran named Taurus, lifted his sword for the final blow. Blandina looked at him and whispered, "You look tired, friend. I forgive you." His hand trembled. He struck, clumsily missing, and needed 3 attempts. That night, Taurus vanished into Rome's Christian underground. His conversion note contained just one line: "She called me friend while I killed her." What God teaches such love. And yet, even as faith grew, philosophy faltered. Seneca, Rome's greatest Stoic, watched these spectacles with revulsion, and yet returned again and again. In a letter he confessed, "I went expecting wit and relaxation. I found butchery. I come home more greedy, more cruel, more inhuman." He knew the games were poison, yet he could not stay away. The empire's sharpest mind was dragged into the same vortex as the mob. If even Seneca could not resist, what hope was there for anyone else? This was the true revelation. Rome did not merely corrupt politics or architecture or religion. It corrupted the human soul. Mothers sat with children on their laps, watching men burn as though they were torches at a festival. Priests sang hymns while beasts devoured prisoners. Merchants laughed as gladiators bled. Vice had become virtue. Murder had become morality. The dark history of ancient Rome is not that it killed millions. It is that it convinced millions that killing was right. It bent myth until it snapped. It twisted faith into fuel. It lured philosophers into complicity, and it left a question that still echoes today. If Rome could rewrite Orpheus, desecrate martyrs, and seduce Seneca, what illusions in our own world are we applauding without even realizing it? The betrayal of AD 52 was not just a massacre. It was the drowning of Rome's soul. On that October day, as Claudius rose from his purple-draped box and ordered the condemned to resume fighting, 19,000 men realized in unison that obedience meant nothing. They had saluted, they had fought, they had given Rome everything it demanded, and yet still they were condemned. It was not a game. It was mechanized murder disguised as mercy. The scene defies imagination. Exhausted men swung dull swords with trembling arms, not to win, but to delay the inevitable. Ships already splintered rammed blindly into each other. The water once blue thickened into a sea of crimson. Some prisoners dove beneath the surface, choosing drowning over continued humiliation. Guards in small boats jabbed poles into the depths, forcing them back up to die properly. Arrows rained from the edges of the basin, deliberately aimed not to kill, but to wound, prolonging the performance. There was no exit, no salvation, only an audience demanding more. A Greek prisoner, Theron of Athens, found the strength to climb his ship's mast. With a voice hoarse from salt and blood, he shouted, "Romans, you watch us die for sport, but we are men. We had families, we had names." An arrow silenced him mid-sentence. His body plunged into the red water, swallowed by thousands of others. The crowd erupted not in horror, but in satisfaction. Even defiance had become content. By sunset, not a single man remained alive. 19,000 lives ended, and Claudius declared the spectacle magnificent. The Senate recorded it as a triumph of Roman entertainment. But something had shifted. Even the mob, seasoned by decades of blood, left subdued. Parents carried children past drainage pipes that gushed red. Slaves fished corpses from water still steaming with death. A senator named Cassius wrote that night, I have attended games for 40 years. Today was different. We did not watch men die. We watched Rome's soul drown with them. And yet the machine did not stop. It could not stop. Every emperor that followed sought to surpass his predecessor, staging grander massacres, bloodier executions, more elaborate deceptions. Once cruelty becomes entertainment, escalation is inevitable. Rome devoured its own humanity in the chase for novelty. But no amount of blood could hide empty treasuries, invading armies, and collapsing borders. Bread and circuses dulled the pain, but could not cure the rot. When Rome finally fell, it left behind not only ruins, but a permanent lesson. A warning that civilization's greatest danger is not invasion from without, but rot from within. That when a people learn to cheer at suffering, they have already surrendered their morality. Rome taught us that cruelty, once normalized, never retreats. It demands more until nothing satisfies. And here lies the shocking truth: though the Colosseum stands in ruin, its spirit is not gone. The arena has only changed shape. We no longer sit on stone benches, but in front of glowing screens. We no longer cheer for swords and beasts, but for humiliation, failure, and suffering packaged as entertainment. Viral videos, scandal feeds, live streams of pain, each click is a modern cheer, each share a digital roar. The digital Colosseum thrives, and we are its spectators. Seneca's words echo across centuries. He confessed that every time he left the arena, he was more greedy, more cruel, more inhuman. He knew the poison, yet he returned. Are we any different? We consume endless spectacles of suffering, tragedy as content, downfall as entertainment, telling ourselves it is harmless, even educational. But every view leaves a trace. Every indulgence in cruelty reshapes us. We become what we watch. The 19,000 who drowned in Claudius's Naumachia believed civilization meant something. They believed rules mattered. They believed obedience earned mercy. Their discovery was Rome's darkest revelation: when entertainment outweighs humanity, even perfect compliance cannot save you. Their names were never recorded. Their bodies were burned in mass pits outside the city. In the emperor's log, they became a single line: Claudius provided exceptional games. And yet, their silence speaks louder than Claudius's triumph. In their deaths lies a warning we still refuse to hear. That the transformation from citizen to spectator, from empathy to appetite, from human to consumer, happens one atrocity at a time. That one day you may find yourself not in the audience but in the arena. Because the arena never dies. It only evolves. This is the dark history of ancient Rome. This is the shocking truth of the forgotten empire. And its echo is not buried in marble ruins, it vibrates in every viral spectacle we consume today. What do we learn from 19,000 men who drowned under Claudius's command? That civilization is always just one decision away from turning its citizens into content. That cruelty is not a Roman disease, it is a human temptation. Rome collapsed, but its shadow stretches into our age, where the arena is no longer marble but digital, no longer filled with swords but with screens. The Colosseum never fell. It moved online. If that realization unsettles you, it should. Because the real danger is not Claudius or Nero, it is us. The mob who kept coming back. The citizens who convinced themselves that murder was morality, that betrayal was mercy. Rome's shocking truth is that the crowd was complicit. And so are we. Every time we click share or laugh at humiliation, we reenact the same bargain: empathy for entertainment. We tell ourselves it is harmless, but so did they. Yet here is the escape awareness. The martyrs who sang in the flames, the philosophers who confessed their weakness, the nameless prisoners who shouted their identities, Before being silenced, they left us more than tragedy. They left us a mirror. They force us to ask, will we be the crowd, or will we be the witness who refuses to cheer? That choice begins with you, right now. If you felt something stir during this journey, disgust, sorrow, reflection, don't let it fade when the video ends. Leave a comment with one word arena. Show that you will not be silent. Save this story so you can return to it when the noise of the digital coliseum feels overwhelming. And subscribe not just for another episode, but as an act of resistance to remind algorithms that there is an audience for truth, not just spectacle. Because the forgotten voices of Rome are not really gone. They echo in every choice we make. And if enough of us listen, maybe history's darkest lesson does not have to repeat itself. So I ask you, not as a storyteller, but as a witness, will you walk out of the arena unchanged? Or will you carry its warning into the world? The choice is yours. The echo is yours. The future is yours.